Imagine this. England once almost became a French-speaking country. This isn't a joke. This isn't a myth. English kings had French blood. They owned lands in France. And inside the royal court, it wasn't English you heard. It was French. So here's the real question. Was the Hundred Years' War truly about land? Or was it the moment two nations finally decided, who are we? Because this wasn't just a war of swords. It was a war of identity, a war of language, and one of the longest hate stories in history. A rivalry that turned two peoples into eternal enemies, France and England. Now, let's begin. The roots of this hatred go far deeper than the Hundred Years' War. Let's ask the real question. Why did England come to see France as an enemy, when once upon a time, they were almost the same family? Yes, the same family. And the beginning of this story is one of history's greatest breaking points. The year 1066. That year, England's fate changed forever. Because in 1066, William of Normandy, known to history as William the Conqueror, crossed the Channel from France and conquered England. But this wasn't just a battle. It was the implantation of something foreign inside England. A foreign law, a foreign language, a foreign identity. So what happened after William took England? He didn't simply sit on the throne. He began to reshape England's very soul. Let's begin. When William conquered England, he didn't just defeat a king, he replaced the entire upper class. Because William understood something simple. Real power doesn't come from a crown, it comes from land. So after the conquest, his first move wasn't celebration, it was control. He stripped the old Anglo-Saxon nobles of their estates and handed England's richest lands to his own men, the Norman elite, the French-speaking aristocracy. And that wasn't just a reward system, it was a calculated occupation. Almost overnight, ancient English noble families were pushed aside. Norman lords took their place, castles rose across the countryside, and a new ruling class was born. Imagine what that felt like for ordinary people. A peasant wakes up in the same village, on the same soil his family has lived on for generations. But now the land belongs to someone foreign, someone who doesn't speak his language, someone who doesn't share his customs, someone who rules him like a stranger. And that's when England began to split into two worlds. Above, Norman castles, French nobles, foreign power. Below, English villages, English voices, silent resentment. The Norman aristocracy didn't only take land, they brought an entire system with them. Law written in French, taxes demanded in French, courts run in French, a royal court that sounded more like France than England. England was still England, but its rulers didn't feel English. For years, power in England spoke with a French accent, and this didn't just create a social division. It planted something far more dangerous, a deep national humiliation. Because the most powerful kind of hatred in history is not born from strangers. It's born when a people feel like second-class citizens in their own home. And that resentment, that silent anger, would one day explode, turning France and England into enemies for centuries. There are wounds in history that aren't carved by swords. They don't begin with blood. They begin in silence and grow for generations. And the most dangerous seed of hatred between France and England was not land. It was not crowns. It was language. Because humiliating a nation's language is never just about words. It is about making people feel smaller, making them feel second class in their own home. After 1066, when William conquered England, he didn't only take castles, he changed the language of power. Inside the royal court, inside the law, inside the courts of justice, English was not the language that mattered, French was. And this wasn't accidental. It was occupation, done intelligently. English villagers still spoke English in markets and fields, but the rulers looked at that language as something low, something unrefined, almost worthless. The message was clear: we are above you, and language became the sharpest symbol of that division, because it didn't stop at conversation. It reached into justice itself. Imagine standing in a courtroom, hearing your future decided, in a language you barely understand. Sentences delivered, not in your voice, but in the voice of foreign power. That isn't only injustice, that is humiliation. And over time, England split into two worlds. Below, English voices, cold villages, silent anger above. French words, warm castles, foreign control. A wall formed between us and them, not in stone, but in identity. So when the Hundred Years' War finally began, people didn't fight only for territory. They fought for pride, for belonging, for who they truly were. Because in history, sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the sword, it's the language. When the Hundred Years' War began, almost everyone expected one outcome. France would win. France was larger, richer, more populated, more powerful on paper. England was a smaller island kingdom, but history often proves one brutal truth. The stronger side doesn't always win. The better prepared side does. And in the early years of this war, England shocked Europe. So why was England winning? Because England didn't fight like France. England fought smarter. France believed the battlefield belonged to knights. Heavy armor, mounted charges, honor and glory. But England's real weapon wasn't the knight. It was something simpler and far deadlier. The English longbow. This bow was terrifying, not just because it could shoot far, but because it could shoot fast. A trained English archer could fire multiple arrows in a minute, and those arrows weren't harmless. They could pierce chainmail and sometimes even damage armor. Now imagine the battlefield. French knights charge forward, and suddenly the sky turns black. An arrow storm falls like rain. Horses panic. Men fall. Formations collapse. France's greatest strength, its knightly charge, became a nightmare. French nobles often treated war like a stage. The goal wasn't just victory, it was personal fame. To be seen, to be remembered, to be heroic. So France often attacked quickly, proudly, aggressively. But England fought differently. England's strategy was cold and calculated. Don't rush to them. Make them come to you. And that single mindset changed everything. England didn't rely on brute force. They built battlefield traps. They positioned their archers carefully, often behind protective barriers, sharpened wooden stakes, rough terrain, defensive lines. So when France charged, they didn't hit an open field. They hit a wall of arrows, a wall of strategy. By the time the French knights reached English lines, they were already broken. In key battles like Crécy and Poitiers, the weather made France suffer. Rain turned fields into mud, and mud is deadly when you wear heavy armor. A knight in plate armor is powerful on dry ground, but in mud, he becomes slow, clumsy, trapped. Horses slipped, men sank, charges lost momentum, and once the charge slowed down, the archers destroyed them. France had numbers, but England had something else: efficiency. England's army structure was simpler. Its decisions were faster. Its commanders worked more smoothly. France, on the other hand, was large and often politically chaotic. French nobles argued. Power was fragmented. Coordination weakened. So even when France had greater strength, it couldn't always control it. The result, England humiliated France early on. So in the early years of the Hundred Years' War, England did what no one expected. It pushed France back. It captured victories. It created humiliation. And humiliation is dangerous. Because humiliation creates one thing: revenge. This is why, later in the war, France would evolve. France would adapt. France would rise again and produce one of the most legendary figures in European history, Joan of Arc. But that is the next chapter. But England's early victories didn't mean the war was over. Not even close. Because France didn't stay broken forever. It learned. It adapted. And slowly, it began to change the rules of the war. For years, France had been fighting the wrong war. It relied too heavily on knights, on pride, on tradition. But after humiliation, France realized a terrifying truth. Honor won't save us, only strategy will. So France reorganized. It strengthened the crown's control over the army. It reduced the chaos of noble rivalries. And most importantly, it started building something England feared more than knights, a modern fighting force. Then the battlefield changed forever. France began to use gunpowder more effectively. Cannons, still primitive, still loud, still unpredictable, became a symbol of a new age. Castles that once stood proud for centuries could now be shattered. Walls that once meant safety now meant nothing, and slowly England's advantage began to fade. The longbow was deadly, but cannons were destiny. 3. England starts collapsing from within, and while France was growing stronger, England began to weaken because England was fighting a war far from home. Every campaign in France drained gold. Every loss drained men. Every year drained hope. And back in England, political tension grew. People started asking, why are we dying for French land? How long will this continue? Is this war worth it? England wasn't just fighting France anymore. It was fighting exhaustion. And that is when history does something strange. Just as France seemed doomed, a single person appears. Not a king, not a general, not a knight, a teenage village girl. Her name, Joan of Arc. She had no crown, no army training, no noble blood. But she had something more powerful than any weapon: belief. Joan claimed she had visions, that God had chosen her, that France would rise again. And at first, people laughed. But France was desperate, so they listened. Joan wasn't strong because she fought like a soldier. She was strong because she gave France back its spirit. She turned fear into faith. She turned defeat into fury. And she led France to one of its greatest turning points, the Siege of Orleans. Orleans was the key. If Orleans fell, France might collapse completely. But Joan arrived like fire. And suddenly, France fought differently. Not with pride, with purpose, and against all expectations. France lifted the siege. Orleans was saved. And the impossible happened. France began to believe again. 6. The war turns. France takes back its land. After Orleans, momentum shifted. France started reclaiming territory piece by piece. It wasn't just Joan. It was the transformation she ignited. A stronger army, better leadership, growing unity. England still had power, but France now had something England couldn't crush: national identity. Joan's story ends tragically. She was captured, put on trial, and executed, burned alive. But here's what makes her immortal. Joan died, but France didn't collapse, because by then she had already done her real job. She had awakened a nation. As the years passed, England lost more territory, more money, more soldiers. And then, the end arrived, 1453. France pushed England out of nearly all its lands. The war was over, and England was left with almost nothing in France. After more than a century, the dream was dead. 9. The real legacy: not land, but identity. And here's the final truth. This war didn't only redraw maps, it created nations. Before this war, many people didn't think of themselves as French or English. They were loyal to lords, to regions, to local rulers. But after the 100 Years' War, people began to think differently. I am English, I am French, and even language changed. English rose in England. French became the symbol of France. So in the end, this wasn't just a war of territory. It was a war that decided who England truly was, who France truly was. A war that turned neighbors into rivals and shaped Europe forever. And so, the 100 Years' War finally ended. At the beginning, it looked like a simple struggle for land and crowns, a fight over inheritance, titles, and territory. But in the end, this war changed far more than maps. France won. England lost nearly all of its lands in France. After 1453, the English dream of holding France was shattered, and the idea of two crowns on one head disappeared into history. But the greatest outcome wasn't just military. The real victory happened inside people's minds. Because this war didn't only create borders, it created nations. Before this conflict, many people didn't think of themselves as French or English. They were loyal to local lords, to regions, to whoever held power nearby. But after more than a century of bloodshed, two identities became unbreakable. I am French, I am English, and language changed too. For centuries, French had dominated England's royal court, but war awakened pride. English rose, from villages to kings, and became the voice of a nation. French, in turn, became the symbol of French identity and unity. So this war wasn't won only with swords. It was won through language as well. France reclaimed its homeland, but England returned home divided. And that defeat helped ignite future internal conflict. And here comes history's greatest irony. Once, France influenced England's crown, but today the world's global language is English. While France still protects its language fiercely, because the French understand something powerful. Sometimes a nation's strongest fortress is not a wall of stone, it's its language. So let's talk about what the 100 Years' War really did. Because if you think this war was only about castles and land, then you're missing the real story. Let me ask you something. If France was bigger, richer, and more powerful, how did England win so many early battles? And then, another question, how did France recover and eventually drive England out? This is where it gets interesting, because the 100 Years' War wasn't just a war, it was a long, brutal process that reshaped two nations. At the beginning, England looked unstoppable. Longbows, smart tactics, defensive positions. France, despite all its wealth, kept falling into the same trap, charging like it was still the old world, while England was already fighting like the new world. But then France changed, and here's something people don't talk about enough. France didn't win because it suddenly became stronger. France won because it became smarter. It reorganized, it improved command, it embraced gunpowder. Cannons started breaking the old rules. Walls that once meant safety suddenly meant nothing. And once that happened, England's biggest advantage started fading. Now let's take a step back and think. What do you think hurts more? Losing a battle or losing your identity? Because honestly, the most important result of this war wasn't even military. It was psychological. Before this war, people didn't walk around saying, I'm French or I'm English. Most people were loyal to their lord, their town, their region. But after a century of death, taxes, burning villages, identity became everything. People needed something bigger to hold on to. And that's what this war created, nations. And this is where the language part becomes shocking. Because imagine this, England was England. But for centuries, the ruling class spoke French. French in court, French in law, French in noble culture. So ask yourself, how can a people truly feel free when the language of power doesn't even sound like them? That's why this war did something incredible. It helped English rise, not just as a language, but as a symbol of we are not them. And France did the same. France didn't just fight to push England out. France fought to become France. That's why Joan of Arc matters so much. Not only because she inspired soldiers, but because she inspired identity. She made people believe they weren't just fighting for a king, they were fighting for a homeland. Now here's the final twist. Most wars end with a map change, and people move on. But this one created a rivalry that lasted for centuries. Even after 1453, when England lost almost everything in France, the hatred didn't disappear. It transformed. It evolved. It became cultural. And today, look at the irony. Once French dominated England's elites, but now the world's global language is English, and France still protects its language fiercely. And honestly, can you blame them? Because after everything we just discussed, it makes sense. They've learned what history teaches the hard way. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a sword, it's identity, it's culture, it's language. So let me ask you one last question. If you had to choose, what mattered more in this war? The land, the crown, or the moment two nations finally decided who they were? Drop your answer in the comments. Because this war didn't just change Europe, it shaped the modern world. And if you want more hidden stories like this, make sure to follow and subscribe. Because history is never just the past.